So Egypt, Uganda, Ethiopia and Congo-Brazzaville, these are the four countries on Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov's charm offensive tour of Africa. His country's war with Ukraine has been blamed for the cost of living crisis around the world, including Africa, where food and fuel prices are skyrocketing and populations want their government to alleviate their suffering. So when those shipments do happen, it won't come a moment too soon for many African countries which depend on Ukrainian grain. So that brings us to the diplomatic offensive in Africa. Russia wants the continent on its side in the battle to win friends and influence people between Moscow and the West. But so does the US. So with both Russia and America jostling to make their case in Africa, what's being made of their arguments? For more on this, I'm joined now by Gavin, Senior Fellow for African Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. Michelle, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Very nice to see you again. So after the meeting with officials in Egypt, the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov is also visiting Congo, Ethiopia and Uganda. It's been called a diplomatic offensive. What exactly is Russia trying to achieve, do you think?
Well, it's an excellent question, and thank you for having me. I think that for Russia, in many ways, they're simply trying to avoid a situation in which the consensus, the international consensus that their invasion of Ukraine was illegitimate gets any larger. So it's sort of a containment policy to some degree. And I think they hope eventually to build kind of a counter coalition, if you will, of states supporting their position. But in the immediate term, given the economic pressure that Russia is experiencing, I think that what they want is to ensure things don't get worse, and that there are voices of support on the international stage for their preferred narrative about their invasion of Ukraine.
Do you think relations between Russia and African countries such as Egypt, which has always been strong, have now become strained because of this food crisis?
Well, I think the food crisis has certainly strained many things, the capacity of many states all over the world to deal with one of the most kind of fundamental issues in any society, is the ability to ensure that people can survive and be fed. But I think that many states in Africa and elsewhere are really caught in a difficult position. So yes, there may be some strain on their relationship with Russia, but strain on their relationship with Western powers as well, who wish they would take a stronger position in condemning the invasion of Ukraine. So as so much of Africa tries to maintain a kind of non-aligned posture, they're being pushed and pulled in different directions by external powers who see the stakes differently, certainly. I think for the US, right, there's a huge concern both about the immediate food crisis, but also about what happens when we live in a world where powerful states can run around kind of annexing the territory of their neighbors by force. So it's a concern about the kind of diminishment of international norms. And for Russia, of course, they're looking for a way to amass power in this new era and have influence, despite their relative sort of paucity of economic incentives to do that. But they have certainly, they're one of the most significant arms dealers on the continent. They have mercenaries who've provided security to a number of actors. So they have things on offer. It's a different menu.
Well, you've made some very interesting points there, and I want to come back and talk a little bit about the security dimension a little bit later in the chat. But you mentioned the US. Obviously, it has also got something of its own diplomatic offensive in Africa at the moment. How long can African countries stay out of this confrontation between Russia and the West?
Well, I can completely understand and would imagine that as long as possible would be the answer in the sense that I could understand the position of most African states having no desire to insert themselves in a tussle between two external parties. That said, I don't think, the entire world is experiencing the fallout from the invasion of Ukraine. And this is, to me, a really interesting example of where African agency, the African equities have to be considered on the international stage as the whole world tries to work through the problem set and the economic repercussions, the supply chain repercussions of what's happened here. It's incredibly important, I think, that African perspectives be a part of that consideration. And there's no ability to hide from that. I'm not suggesting that African governments want to hide from it, but it's a fine diplomatic line to walk to ensure that perspective is heard and is considered in the sort of policy options before states around the world without necessarily feeling one has to take sides in a kind of geopolitical struggle that I think for many of us harkens back to an era that no one is particularly eager to repeat.
Yes, that's a good point. And of course, the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, he's dismissed claims that Moscow is to blame for the global food crisis and a surge in prices. I mean, what sort of assurances, I know you're not in their heads or anything, but you're obviously an analyst, what sort of assurances do you think African countries are going to want from Russia in terms of this grain deal, which we've seen put into jeopardy at the weekend with Russian shelling?
Well, precisely. It's a little hard to feel confident in their good faith at this point. The assurances would be seeing the action of grain being released from Ukrainian ports, not being seized first by Russians looking to make a profit, but allowing the supply of food, desperately needed food, to flow in global commerce unimpeded and uninterfered with. So, I don't think it's hard to find the evidence or lack thereof of a sense of urgency on the part of Russia to address this issue.
And you mentioned earlier the security dimension. Of course, in the last 10 years, there's been concerted effort. The evidence is clearly there to deepen the security dimension between Russia and a lot of African countries, with many of them buying their weapons from Russia, not to mention private military companies like the Wagner Group in operation in various hotspots in Africa. What do you make of that?
Well, I think that it's worth looking at the results that Russians have been able to deliver. So, how compelling a case does Russia make for itself? Would anybody like to live in the security environment that they have provided in the Central African Republic? Is that desirable compared to other models? In Mozambique, they weren't really apparently up to the task. And it's African forces who made headway in actually addressing the insurgency in Cabo Delgado. So I do think that I recognize there are a number of governments facing very serious security crises and looking for options, but I'm not sure that the record of Russian support is terribly compelling.
And of course, Russia makes a big play, and it certainly gets heard in Africa, by saying that it never was a colonial power, and that it respects African sovereignty and territorial integrity, notwithstanding that some of that has been put into question with, as you mentioned, Russia invading a country next to it, Ukraine, and violating its territorial integrity. How much traction does that narrative get in Africa?
Well, I think there's no question that there are many African political parties and many African countries with long histories of collaboration and cooperation with Russia and with the predecessor Soviet Union. So there's no question that there are historical ties there. Many prominent African leaders and intellectuals at one point went to school in what's now Russia. And so I don't discount the importance of these things. I would say that, again, the historical record is not entirely a positive one, just like the record of the U.S. isn't. We were not a colonial power, but there's no question. I don't think there's any honest analyst who looks at the history of the Cold War and thinks that the U.S. Covered itself in glory, or that there were nothing but proud moments in the history of U.S. policy on the continent. And the same is very true for the Soviet Union and for Russia. So yes, their history is long. Some of the relationships are deep, but the record is mixed. And I think that Africans are well aware of that. I don't think that they need, anybody needs a lesson on their own history and the role that external powers have played for the positive and the negative. And that absolutely includes Russia.
Right. So we've talked about Russia's attempt to increase its influence in Africa. We've seen the Americans and the French as well, not to mention the Chinese. Do you think that African countries are deftly managing to play these nations off against each other to their benefit?
Well, I think that that's a possibility, certainly, and there are maybe instances where that's what's happening. But I think right now, in a context of food crisis, economic crisis for many states, debt crisis, still coming out of the pain of the pandemic. I'm not sure that there are many places that feel that Africa's sort of come out with the upper hand in its relationship with external powers. And you're quite right. The suitors of Africa are many. It's not just Western powers. It's not just Russia. It's not just China. There's a great deal of activity coming out of the Gulf states as well. And I think that it's difficult in a continent as diverse, with diverse interests and points of view as Africa is. But I do think, when there are issues that actually unite Africans, and perhaps more robust engagement on the international stage would serve the continent very well.
Really very interesting talking with you again, Michelle. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Michelle Gavin is a Senior Fellow for Africa Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations.